The winter winds carried more than snow across the valley that December morning. They carried whispers of change, of decisions that could no longer be postponed, of hearts that had learned to hope despite the shadows of the past. Elizabeth Catherine Hammond, she was still getting used to thinking of herself by that name again, stood at the kitchen window of the Wesley ranch house, watching the world transform beneath a blanket of pristine white. 3 weeks had passed since her meeting with Jameson, 3 weeks of sleepless nights and careful conversations, 3 weeks of feeling as though she lived suspended between two different lives. The letter had arrived yesterday, delivered by a rider who had traveled through the mountain passes despite the threatening weather. Her father's handwriting, once so familiar, now seemed like something from a half-remembered dream. The words were simple enough. "My dearest Elizabeth, Mr. Jameson has told me of your circumstances, and I write not to demand your return, but to beg your forgiveness. The marriage contract with the Mobley family has been dissolved, and Charles has married another. You are free to choose your own path, my daughter, though I pray that path might some day lead you home to a father who loves you more than his own foolish pride. Your inheritance awaits you, as does my hope for reconciliation. With all my love and deepest regrets, your father." She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, where it seemed to burn against her hip like a brand. The inheritance he mentioned would be substantial, enough to secure not just her own future, but the future of anyone she chose to share it with. Enough to save the Wesley ranch from the creditors who circled like vultures, enough to ensure that Theodore never again bore the weight of impossible financial burdens on his shoulders. The irony was not lost on her. 4 years ago, she had fled from wealth that felt like a prison. Now that same wealth offered her the power to protect the people she had come to love. But accepting it would mean returning to Boston, at least temporarily, to settle legal matters and arrange for the transfer of funds. It would mean re-entering a world that had once nearly destroyed her, facing questions and scrutiny from society matrons who would remember the scandal of her disappearance. "You're up early," Martha's voice came from behind her, gentle and knowing. The older woman moved with practiced quiet around the kitchen, beginning the familiar ritual of preparing breakfast for the family. There was something comforting about the routine, the same motions repeated each morning regardless of the turmoil that might be churning beneath the surface of their lives. "I couldn't sleep," Elizabeth admitted, turning from the window to face the woman who had become more of a mother to her than her own had ever been. "I keep thinking about the letter, about what my father is asking of me." Martha set down the coffee-pot and studied Elizabeth's face with the keen perception that came from years of reading the subtle signs of emotional distress in the people she loved. "He's not asking anything of you, dear. From what you told me, he's offering you a choice." "But what kind of choice is it, really?" Elizabeth's voice carried a note of frustration that she tried to keep gentle. "If I stay here as Sarah McKenna, I'm living a lie. But if I return to Boston as Elizabeth Hammond, I might lose everything that truly matters to me." "And what truly matters to you?" Martha asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. Elizabeth's eyes moved unconsciously toward the window that overlooked the corral, where even now she could see Theodore working with the horses despite the early hour and the threatening sky. He moved with the easy grace that had first caught her attention 3 years ago, his patient strength evident in every gesture as he gentled a nervous mare. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he carried himself when he was wrestling with problems that seemed to have no good solutions. "Him," she said simply. "This place. The life we've built together, even if we've never spoken of it directly. But how can I ask him to accept help from Elizabeth Hammond's fortune when he fell in love with Sarah McKenna's simple honesty?" Martha's smile was sad but understanding. "Child, you're not two different people. You're one woman who has lived through difficult circumstances and come out stronger for it. The money doesn't change who you are in your heart." "Doesn't it?" Elizabeth turned back to the window, watching snowflakes spiral downward like the fragments of her scattered thoughts. "Theodore is a proud man, Martha. He's spent his whole life working for everything he has, taking care of his family through his own efforts. If I suddenly reveal that I have enough money to solve all his problems, how can he not feel diminished by that? How can our relationship survive such an imbalance? The question hung in the warming air of the kitchen like smoke from the wood stove, heavy with implications that neither woman was quite ready to explore fully. Elizabeth knew that Martha loved her like a daughter, but she also knew that the older woman's first loyalty would always be to Theodore's happiness. If Elizabeth's presence in their lives, in whatever form, threatened to cause him pain, Martha would not hesitate to encourage her to leave. "You're assuming he would see your inheritance as something that diminishes him," Martha said after a long moment of consideration. "But what if he sees it as something that liberates him? What if knowing that you have the means to take care of yourself actually frees him to love you for who you are, rather than feeling obligated to protect and provide for you?" The possibility had not occurred to Elizabeth, and she found herself considering it with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Could wealth actually remove barriers rather than create them? Could knowing that she didn't need his protection make their connection more authentic rather than less? The sound of boots on the front porch interrupted her contemplation, followed by the familiar creak of the door and Theodore's voice calling out a greeting. Elizabeth felt her heart perform its usual quickening dance at the sound, a reaction that 3 years of proximity had done nothing to diminish. If anything, the passage of time had only deepened her feelings for him, adding layers of respect and admiration to the initial attraction that had bloomed despite her best efforts to suppress it. "Morning, Mother," Theodore said as he entered the kitchen, stamping snow from his boots and unwinding the scarf from around his neck. His cheeks were reddened from the cold, his dark hair damp with melted snowflakes, and his green eyes bright with the particular energy that came from working outdoors in challenging weather. "The storm's coming in faster than expected. We'll need to bring the cattle closer to the barn if we don't want to lose any in the drifts." "I'll help," Elizabeth said automatically, though she immediately wondered if such an offer was appropriate now that her circumstances had changed. Was she still the hard-working ranch hand who could be counted on for any task, or had learning about her inheritance somehow transformed her into a delicate flower who needed to be protected from harsh weather and demanding work? Theodore's eyes met hers across the kitchen, and she saw the same uncertainty reflected in his gaze. The easy companionship they had shared for 3 years now felt strained, complicated by unspoken questions about who she really was and what role she should play in their lives going forward. "That's not necessary," he said carefully, his tone more formal than it had been since those first awkward weeks after her arrival. "The hands and I can manage the cattle." The rejection stung more than Elizabeth had expected, confirming her worst fears about how her revealed identity was changing the dynamic between them. She was no longer Sarah McKenna, whose help was welcome and needed. She was Elizabeth Hammond, whose assistance might be seen as inappropriate or unnecessary given her social standing. "Of course," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I'll help your mother with the indoor preparations, then." Something flickered across Theodore's face at her subdued response, but before he could say anything more, Ernest Wesley emerged from the back room where he conducted the ranch's business affairs. His expression was grim, the worry lines around his eyes more pronounced than Elizabeth had ever seen them. "Son, we need to talk," he said without preamble, glancing apologetically at Elizabeth and Martha. "Ladies, if you'll excuse us, there are some business matters that require immediate attention." Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather seeping through the walls. She had overheard enough hushed conversations in recent weeks to know that the ranch's financial situation had grown increasingly desperate. Cattle prices had fallen, several creditors were demanding payment, and the harsh winter was making it impossible to move livestock to market. The timing of her father's letter, arriving just as the Wesley family faced their darkest hour, seemed almost like divine providence, or cruel irony. As the two men retreated to the office, Elizabeth caught sight of official-looking papers scattered across Ernest's desk, documents marked with the forbidding stamps and seals of banks and legal firms. The weight of the letter in her pocket seemed to increase, and she found herself wrestling with an almost overwhelming urge to march into that room and solve all their problems with a few words about her inheritance. But what would be the cost of such generosity? Would Theodore be grateful, or would he feel emasculated by her ability to rescue his family when he could not? Would their relationship survive the revelation that she had possessed the means to help them all along, but had chosen to keep silent while watching them struggle? "They're going to lose the ranch," Martha said quietly, voicing the fear that none of them had been willing to speak aloud. Her hands were busy with breakfast preparations, but Elizabeth could see the tremor in her fingers, the way she kept glancing toward the closed office door. "Ernest didn't want to worry Theodore with the full extent of our debts, but I've seen the letters from the bank. They're calling in the mortgage." Elizabeth felt as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. "When?" "End of February, unless we can come up with the full amount." Martha's voice was steady, but Elizabeth could see tears gathering in her eyes. 40 years we've been on this land, 40 years of building something good and honest. And now it's all going to slip away because we had a run of bad luck and trusted the wrong people with our business. The injustice of it burned in Elizabeth's chest like acid. The Wesley family had worked tirelessly, treated their employees fairly, and contributed to their community in countless ways. They were losing their livelihood not because of any moral failing, but because of circumstances largely beyond their control. Drought, falling cattle prices, and the predatory practices of distant financiers who saw ranch properties as nothing more than columns of numbers in their ledgers. "Martha," Elizabeth said slowly, the decision crystallizing in her mind even as she spoke, "what if there was a way to save the ranch? What if someone was willing to pay off the mortgage and give you time to recover?" The older woman looked up sharply, hope and suspicion warring in her expression. "Elizabeth, dear, I know you care about us, but unless you've got several $1,000s hidden under your mattress, I don't see how—" She stopped mid-sentence as understanding dawned. Oh, my dear child, no. We couldn't possibly accept that kind of help from you." "Why not?" Elizabeth's voice was stronger now, fueled by the conviction that she had found the right path forward. "The money is mine by right, whether I want it or not. Why shouldn't I use it to help the people I love?" "Because it would change everything," Martha said gently. "Theodore would never be able to look at you the same way, knowing that you had saved his family's legacy when he couldn't. And you would never know if his feelings for you were genuine or born out of gratitude and obligation." The truth of those words struck Elizabeth like a physical blow, but she forced herself to consider them objectively. Was Martha right? Would Theodore's pride make it impossible for him to accept such help, even if it meant losing everything he had worked for? And would she spend the rest of her life wondering if his love was real or simply a debt he felt obligated to repay? The sound of raised voices from the office interrupted her brooding. Through the thin walls, she could hear Theodore's anger at learning the true extent of their financial troubles, his frustration at being kept in the dark about problems that affected his entire future. There was pain in his voice, too, the sound of a man watching his dreams crumble despite his best efforts to hold them together. "I should have been told sooner," Theodore was saying, his usually controlled voice tight with emotion. "Maybe if I had known how bad things were, I could have found another way to raise the money. Maybe I could have." "There is no other way," Ernest's voice cut through his son's protests. "I've explored every option, Theodore. We've borrowed against everything we own, called in every favor, considered every possibility. Short of a miracle, we're going to lose this place." Elizabeth felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she listened to the conversation that was tearing apart the family she had come to love. These people had given her everything when she had nothing: shelter, purpose, belonging, and love. Now she had the power to return that gift, to ensure that their generosity would not be rewarded with loss and heartbreak. But the question remained: could she do so without destroying the very relationships she was trying to protect? The voices in the office had grown quieter now, descending into the kind of hushed planning that came after the initial shock of crisis had worn off. Elizabeth could picture the two men hunched over the desk, trying to make sense of impossible numbers, searching for solutions that simply didn't exist within the confines of their current circumstances. "I need to go outside," Elizabeth said suddenly, unable to bear the weight of indecision any longer. "I need to think." Martha nodded understandingly, though her eyes remained worried. "Bundle up warm, dear. This storm is going to be a fierce one." Elizabeth wrapped herself in her heaviest cloak and stepped out into the swirling snow, welcoming the bite of cold air against her face. The world had been transformed since dawn, the familiar landmarks of the ranch now softened and obscured by the steadily falling flakes. It was beautiful and harsh in equal measure, like so many aspects of the life she had built here. She made her way to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch, where several generations of Wesley family members rested beneath simple stone markers. The snow was already beginning to obscure the carved names and dates, but Elizabeth knew them by heart. Theodore's grandparents, two infant siblings who had died before he was born, and his uncle who had died in the war between the states before he could marry and have children of his own. This was the family history that Theodore was fighting to preserve, the legacy that gave meaning to all his hard work and sacrifice. How could she stand by and watch it disappear when she had the power to save it? And yet, how could she risk destroying the trust and respect that had grown between them by revealing that she had possessed the means to help all along? As she stood among the snow-covered graves, Elizabeth found herself remembering the stories Martha had told her about the early days of the ranch. Theodore's grandfather had started with nothing but determination and a handful of cattle, building the ranch slowly through decades of back-breaking work. His father had expanded the operation, weathering droughts and market crashes through careful planning and stubborn persistence. Theodore had inherited not just property, but a tradition of independence and self-reliance that had shaped his character from childhood. To accept her financial help would mean abandoning that tradition, admitting that all their efforts had been insufficient to preserve what their ancestors had built. She could understand why such an admission might be more painful to Theodore than the loss of the ranch itself. But surely the preservation of the land and the family legacy was more important than pride? Surely Theodore would eventually come to see her intervention as an act of love rather than charity? The sound of footsteps crunching through the snow interrupted her contemplation. She turned to see Theodore approaching, his hat pulled low against the driving wind, his coat dusted white with accumulated flakes. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his posture, the way he carried himself when grappling with problems that seemed insurmountable. "I thought I might find you here," he said, coming to stand beside her among the weathered headstones. "Mother said you needed some air." "I needed to think," Elizabeth replied, not trusting herself to look directly at him. "About a lot of things." They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the snow continue to fall around them. The storm was intensifying, and Elizabeth knew they would need to return to the warmth of the house soon, but for now the shared quiet felt necessary, a respite from the emotional turbulence of the morning. "I suppose you heard the conversation in the office," Theodore said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Some of it." Elizabeth pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Enough to understand that things are worse than I realized." "They are." Theodore's admission was quiet but matter-of-fact. "We're going to lose everything, Elizabeth. The ranch, the cattle, probably the house too. By spring, my parents will be starting over with nothing, and I'll be looking for work as a hired hand on someone else's property." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Elizabeth could hear it nonetheless. This was a man who had devoted his entire adult life to building and preserving something meaningful, only to watch it slip away through circumstances largely beyond his control. "There might be another way," she said softly, the words seeming to emerge of their own accord. "If you were willing to consider help from an unexpected source." Theodore turned to look at her directly, his green eyes sharp with a combination of hope and wariness. "What kind of help?" Elizabeth felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she stood at the precipice of a confession that would change everything between them. Once she spoke the words, there would be no taking them back, no returning to the simple dynamic they had shared when she was just Sarah McKenna and he was just Theodore Wesley. "The inheritance my father mentioned in his letter," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "It's substantial, Theodore. More than substantial. Enough to pay off all your debts and give you the breathing room you need to rebuild." For a long moment, Theodore simply stared at her, snow accumulating on his shoulders and hat brim as he processed what she was telling him. Elizabeth could see the exact moment when understanding dawned, followed quickly by a complex mixture of emotions that played across his features: surprise, relief, gratitude, and something that might have been hurt. "You're offering to pay off our mortgage," he said slowly, as if testing the words to see how they felt on his tongue. "I'm offering to use my inheritance to save the ranch," Elizabeth corrected gently. "To preserve something beautiful and meaningful that shouldn't be lost because of the greed of distant bankers." Theodore was quiet for so long that Elizabeth began to fear she had made a terrible mistake. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the storm of emotions beneath the surface. "Elizabeth, I appreciate the offer more than you can know. But I can't accept charity from you, no matter how generous your intentions." "It's not charity," Elizabeth said quickly, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if that was truly accurate. It's an investment in something I care about. In people I care about." "Is it?" Theodore's green eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Or is it guilt, Elizabeth? Are you trying to make up for the fact that you've been living among us under false pretenses, letting us worry about problems you could have solved with a word?" The accusation hit her like a physical blow, partly because it contained enough truth to sting. She had known for weeks that she possessed the means to help the Wesley family, and she had chosen to remain silent while watching them struggle. Had that silence been born of legitimate concerns about their relationship, or had it simply been cowardice? "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I was afraid that learning about my inheritance would change everything between us. I was afraid you would see me differently." "I do see you differently," Theodore admitted, his honesty cutting deeper than any anger could have. "For 3 years, I've known you as someone who understood what it meant to work for everything you had, someone who appreciated the value of simple things because you had experienced genuine need. Now I find out that you're one of the wealthiest women in America, and I don't know what to believe about anything we've shared." Elizabeth felt tears freezing on her cheeks as the full implications of her deception became clear. By trying to protect their relationship, she had actually undermined the foundation of trust upon which it was built. Theodore didn't just reject her offer of financial help. He questioned whether the woman he had fallen in love with had ever truly existed. "I'm still the same person," she said desperately. "The money doesn't change who I am." "Doesn't it?" Theodore's voice was gentle but implacable. It was beautiful and harsh in equal measure, like so many aspects of the life she had built here. She made her way to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the ranch, where several generations of Wesley family members rested beneath simple stone markers. The snow was already beginning to obscure the carved names and dates, but Elizabeth knew them by heart: Theodore's grandparents, 2 infant siblings who had died before he was born, and his uncle who had died in the war between the states before he could marry and have children of his own. This was the family history that Theodore was fighting to preserve, the legacy that gave meaning to all his hard work and sacrifice. How could she stand by and watch it disappear when she had the power to save it? And yet, how could she risk destroying the trust and respect that had grown between them by revealing that she had possessed the means to help all along? As she stood among the snow-covered graves, Elizabeth found herself remembering the stories Martha had told her about the early days of the ranch. Theodore's grandfather had started with nothing but determination and a handful of cattle, building the ranch slowly through decades of back-breaking work. His father had expanded the operation, weathering droughts and market crashes through careful planning and stubborn persistence. Theodore had inherited not just property, but a tradition of independence and self-reliance that had shaped his character from childhood. To accept her financial help would mean abandoning that tradition, admitting that all their efforts had been insufficient to preserve what their ancestors had built. She could understand why such an admission might be more painful to Theodore than the loss of the ranch itself. But surely the preservation of the land and the family legacy was more important than pride? Surely Theodore would eventually come to see her intervention as an act of love rather than charity? The sound of footsteps crunching through the snow interrupted her contemplation. She turned to see Theodore approaching, his hat pulled low against the driving wind, his coat dusted white with accumulated flakes. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his posture, the way he carried himself when grappling with problems that seemed insurmountable. "I thought I might find you here," he said, coming to stand beside her among the weathered headstones. "Mother said you needed some air." "I needed to think," Elizabeth replied, not trusting herself to look directly at him. "About a lot of things." They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the snow continue to fall around them. The storm was intensifying, and Elizabeth knew they would need to return to the warmth of the house soon, but for now the shared quiet felt necessary, a respite from the emotional turbulence of the morning. "I suppose you heard the conversation in the office," Theodore said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Some of it." Elizabeth pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Enough to understand that things are worse than I realized." "They are." Theodore's admission was quiet but matter-of-fact. "We're going to lose everything, Elizabeth. The ranch, the cattle, probably the house too. By spring, my parents will be starting over with nothing, and I'll be looking for work as a hired hand on someone else's property." The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Elizabeth could hear it nonetheless. This was a man who had devoted his entire adult life to building and preserving something meaningful, only to watch it slip away through circumstances largely beyond his control. "There might be another way," she said softly, the words seeming to emerge of their own accord. "If you were willing to consider help from an unexpected source." Theodore turned to look at her directly, his green eyes sharp with a combination of hope and wariness. "What kind of help?" Elizabeth felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she stood at the precipice of a confession that would change everything between them. Once she spoke the words, there would be no taking them back, no returning to the simple dynamic they had shared when she was just Sarah McKenna and he was just Theodore Wesley. "The inheritance my father mentioned in his letter," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "It's substantial, Theodore. More than substantial. Enough to pay off all your debts and give you the breathing room you need to rebuild." For a long moment, Theodore simply stared at her, snow accumulating on his shoulders and hat brim as he processed what she was telling him. Elizabeth could see the exact moment when understanding dawned, followed quickly by a complex mixture of emotions that played across his features: surprise, relief, gratitude, and something that might have been hurt. "You're offering to pay off our mortgage," he said slowly, as if testing the words to see how they felt on his tongue. "I'm offering to use my inheritance to save the ranch," Elizabeth corrected gently. "To preserve something beautiful and meaningful that shouldn't be lost because of the greed of distant bankers." Theodore was quiet for so long that Elizabeth began to fear she had made a terrible mistake. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the storm of emotions beneath the surface. "Elizabeth, I appreciate the offer more than you can know. But I can't accept charity from you, no matter how generous your intentions." "It's not charity," Elizabeth said quickly, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if that was truly accurate. It's an investment in something I care about. In people I care about." "Is it?" Theodore's green eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "Or is it guilt, Elizabeth? Are you trying to make up for the fact that you've been living among us under false pretenses, letting us worry about problems you could have solved with a word?" The accusation hit her like a physical blow, partly because it contained enough truth to sting. She had known for weeks that she possessed the means to help the Wesley family, and she had chosen to remain silent while watching them struggle. Had that silence been born of legitimate concerns about their relationship, or had it simply been cowardice? "I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I was afraid that learning about my inheritance would change everything between us. I was afraid you would see me differently." "I do see you differently," Theodore admitted, his honesty cutting deeper than any anger could have. "For 3 years, I've known you as someone who understood what it meant to work for everything you had, someone who appreciated the value of simple things because you had experienced genuine need. Now I find out that you're one of the wealthiest women in America, and I don't know what to believe about anything we've shared." Elizabeth felt tears freezing on her cheeks as the full implications of her deception became clear. By trying to protect their relationship, she had actually undermined the foundation of trust upon which it was built. Theodore didn't just reject her offer of financial help. He questioned whether the woman he had fallen in love with had ever truly existed. "I'm still the same person," she said desperately. "The money doesn't change who I am." "Doesn't it?" Theodore's voice was gentle but implacable. "Elizabeth, you've spent 3 years watching my family struggle with problems you could have solved in an afternoon. You've accepted our charity while sitting on a fortune that would make our entire ranch seem like pocket change. How is that the action of the woman I thought I knew?" The words struck her with devastating accuracy, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable truth about her own behavior. She had been living a lie, not just about her identity, but about her circumstances and her ability to help the people she claimed to love. Whatever her motivations, the result was the same. She had deceived them all. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "I'm so sorry, Theodore. I never meant for things to happen this way." "I know you didn't." Theodore's voice softened slightly, though the distance in his eyes remained. "But intentions don't change the reality of what has happened. My family is about to lose everything we've worked for, and the woman I love has been sitting on the solution all along without saying a word." The casual reference to love, spoken in the past tense, felt like a knife twisting in her chest. Elizabeth realized that in her efforts to preserve their relationship, she had actually destroyed it. Theodore might forgive her deception eventually, but he would never be able to forget it. And she would never be able to prove that her feelings for him were genuine rather than born of guilt or obligation. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Theodore was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on the storm-shrouded landscape beyond the cemetery. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had been building since the moment she revealed her true identity. "I want you to go back to Boston," he said quietly. "I want you to reclaim your inheritance and live the life you were born to live. And I want you to let us face our problems in our own way, without intervention from Elizabeth Hammond's fortune." The finality in his voice left no room for argument or negotiation. Elizabeth felt something inside her chest crumble like a structure that had been built on unstable ground. All her fears about the money changing everything between them had been realized, but not in the way she had expected. It wasn't Theodore's pride that had destroyed their relationship. It was her own deception. "And us?" she asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Theodore's smile was sad and infinitely gentle. "There is no us, Elizabeth. There was Theodore Wesley and Sarah McKenna, but that woman doesn't exist anymore. Elizabeth Hammond deserves better than a struggling rancher who can't even hold onto his family's legacy." "That's not true," Elizabeth protested, but even as she spoke, she could see that Theodore had already made up his mind. The man who had fallen in love with a mysterious servant girl could not find a way to love the wealthy heiress she had revealed herself to be. As they walked back toward the house through the driving snow, Elizabeth felt as though she were leaving more than just a cemetery behind. She was leaving the life she had built, the identity she had chosen, and the love she had discovered in the simple spaces between daily tasks and shared silences. The warmth of the kitchen felt almost shocking after the bitter cold outside, but Elizabeth barely noticed the change in temperature. Her entire awareness was focused on the conversation she would need to have with Martha and Ernest, the arrangements she would need to make for her departure, and the letter she would need to write to her father accepting his invitation to return home. She had set out to save the Wesley ranch through the revelation of her inheritance. Instead, she had lost everything that truly mattered to her: the trust of the people she loved, the simple life she had cherished, and the hope of a future with the only man who had ever seen her for who she truly was rather than what she possessed. As the storm raged outside the kitchen windows, Elizabeth began to understand that some choices could not be undone, and some deceptions could not be forgiven, no matter how pure the intentions behind them had been. The 3 days that followed passed in a blur of awkward conversations and careful preparations. Elizabeth moved through the house like a ghost, packing her few belongings while trying to avoid the places where she might encounter Theodore. When their paths did cross, he was unfailingly polite but distant, treating her with the formal courtesy he might show any departing guest rather than the woman he had once held in his arms during a late-night vigil with a sick foal. Martha tried to bridge the growing chasm between them with gentle interventions and meaningful looks, but even her motherly wisdom seemed insufficient to heal the wounds that had been opened. Ernest said little, but Elizabeth caught him watching her with a mixture of sadness and understanding that suggested he grasped the full complexity of the situation better than anyone else. On the morning of her departure, Elizabeth stood once more at the kitchen window, watching the sun rise over a landscape transformed by the storm. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world draped in pristine white that glittered like diamonds in the early light. It was heartbreakingly beautiful, and she found herself trying to memorize every detail: the way the light caught the icicles hanging from the barn roof, the tracks of rabbits and deer that crisscrossed the yard, the smoke rising straight up from the chimney in the still morning air. "The stage will be here within the hour," Martha said softly, coming to stand beside her at the window. The older woman's face was composed, but Elizabeth could see the tears she was trying to hold back. "I've packed you some food for the journey, and there's a thermos of coffee to keep you warm." "Thank you," Elizabeth replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything, Martha. For taking me in, for giving me a home, for loving me when I had forgotten how to love myself." Martha's composure cracked slightly at those words, and she reached out to take Elizabeth's hands in her own weathered ones. "You'll always be my daughter, no matter what name you carry or where you go. That doesn't change because of money or circumstances or even the foolish pride of stubborn men." The gentle rebuke toward Theodore was clear, though Martha was too diplomatic to criticize her son directly. Elizabeth squeezed the older woman's hands, drawing comfort from their familiar warmth and strength. "I need you to know," Elizabeth said urgently, "that everything I felt here was real. The person I became in this house, the love I found with your family. None of that was pretense. Sarah McKenna may have been a name I took because I couldn't remember my own, but she wasn't a lie. She was who I truly was when all the expectations and obligations were taken away." "I know that, dear," Martha assured her. "And someday, when his hurt has had time to heal, Theodore will know it too. Men sometimes need longer to work through their feelings, especially when those feelings have been wounded." Elizabeth wanted to believe that was true, but the look in Theodore's eyes during their last conversation suggested damage that went deeper than wounded pride. He had looked at her as though she were a stranger, as though the 3 years they had shared meant nothing in the face of her deception. How could she expect him to forgive her when she wasn't certain she could forgive herself? The sound of wheels on the frozen road announced the arrival of the stage that would carry her away from the only home she had known in 4 years. Elizabeth gathered her small traveling bag, so light compared to the emotional weight she carried, and made her way to the front door. Ernest was waiting there with Theodore, both men bundled against the cold, their expressions carefully neutral. "Miss Hammond," Ernest said formally, though his eyes were kind, "I want you to know that you'll always be welcome in our home, regardless of circumstances. You've been a blessing to this family, and we won't forget that." Elizabeth felt fresh tears threatening at the older man's generosity. Even knowing that she had deceived them, even facing the loss of their ranch, the Wesleys remained true to their fundamental nature, kind, forgiving, and loyal to those they loved. "Thank you, Mr. Wesley," she managed. "I pray that things will work out for you, that you'll find a way to save the ranch without—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't speak aloud the offer that had been so definitively rejected. Theodore stepped forward then, his green eyes meeting hers for the first time in days. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of the old warmth, a shadow of the connection they had shared. But when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. "I hope you find happiness in Boston," he said. "I hope you're able to rebuild the relationship with your father and find peace with your past." The words were kind but final, a benediction that felt like a door closing forever. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and allowed Ernest to escort her to the waiting stage. As the coach pulled away from the ranch house, she turned for one last look at the place that had sheltered and shaped her. Theodore was still standing on the porch, his figure growing smaller as distance increased between them. She thought she saw him raise his hand in farewell, but it might have been her imagination, a desperate wish projected onto a gesture that meant nothing more than politeness. The journey to Denver took 2 days through mountain passes that were treacherous with ice and snow. Elizabeth spent the hours staring out at the stark landscape, feeling as though she were traveling not just away from the ranch, but away from herself. With each mile that passed, Sarah McKenna seemed to fade like a dream upon waking, leaving only Elizabeth Hammond, wealthy, educated, and utterly lost. In Denver, she checked into the finest hotel and sent a telegram to her father announcing her intention to return to Boston. His response arrived within hours, filled with joy and relief that made her feel even more alone. How could she explain to him that she felt like she was returning to prison, even if it was a gilded one? How could she make him understand that the daughter he was welcoming home was not the same woman who had fled 4 years ago? The train journey east was a blur of luxury that felt hollow and meaningless. Elizabeth sat in her private compartment, watching the landscape change from mountains to plains to rolling hills, and felt nothing but emptiness. The pampered life she was returning to, the servants, the elaborate meals, the endless social obligations, seemed like someone else's existence, a costume she would have to wear but could never make truly fit. Boston in January was gray and bitter, the snow dirty with soot from countless chimneys, the air sharp with cold that cut through even the finest wool coat. Elizabeth's father met her at the station personally, something he had never done even when she was a child, and she was shocked by how much he had aged in 4 years. His hair had gone completely white, his face was deeply lined, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose health was fragile. "Elizabeth," he said simply, and there were tears in his eyes as he looked at her. "My dear girl, I thought I would never see you again." She allowed him to embrace her, feeling the frailty in his once strong frame, and found herself genuinely moved by his emotion. Whatever mistakes he had made in the past, his grief at her disappearance had been real and lasting. "Father," she replied, and was surprised to find that the word came naturally despite the years of separation. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I'm sorry for the worry I caused you." "No," he said firmly, pulling back to look at her face. "I'm the one who should apologize. I failed you as a father, Elizabeth. I put my business interests ahead of your happiness, and I nearly lost you forever because of it. Can you ever forgive an old man's foolishness?" The humility in his voice was something she had never heard before, and Elizabeth realized that her disappearance had changed him as much as it had changed her. The autocratic businessman who had tried to force her into an unwanted marriage had been replaced by a man who understood the cost of his mistakes. "Of course I forgive you," she said softly. "We both made choices we regret. The important thing is that we have a chance to start over. The Hammond mansion looked exactly as she remembered it, imposing, elegant, and somehow lifeless despite its grandeur. The servants greeted her return with appropriate deference, but Elizabeth could see the curiosity in their eyes. Where had the missing heiress been all these years? What had happened to her during her mysterious absence? Her old room had been kept exactly as she had left it, as though her father had been waiting for her return all along. The silk wallpaper, the mahogany furniture, the crystal chandelier, everything spoke of wealth and privilege, but Elizabeth felt like a stranger in her own childhood sanctuary. She found herself longing for the simple comfort of her small room above the Wesley's kitchen, for the honest work that had given purpose to her days, for the sound of Theodore's voice calling her name. The legal proceedings to restore her inheritance were complex but straightforward. Her father's lawyers had been preparing for this eventuality, and within a week Elizabeth found herself in control of a fortune that dwarfed even her childhood understanding of her family's wealth. The shipping companies had prospered during her absence, the textile mills had expanded, and careful investments had multiplied the family fortune several times over. She could buy and sell entire townships with what she now possessed. She could solve the Wesley's problems without even noticing the expenditure. The irony was not lost on her. She had more power than she had ever dreamed of, but she had lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered to her. Letters began arriving almost immediately, invitations to social events from families who had shunned her father during the scandal of her disappearance but now sought to curry favor with the returned heiress. Elizabeth read them with a mixture of amusement and disgust, remembering why she had been so eager to escape this world in the first place. "You don't have to accept any of them," her father said one evening as they dined together in the mansion's formal dining room. "I know you need time to readjust to this life." "Do I?" Elizabeth asked, setting down her fork and looking at him directly. "Do I need to readjust to this life, or do I need to find a different one?" Her father's eyebrows rose slightly at the question. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've spent 4 years living differently, Father. I've learned what it means to work for my daily bread, to earn respect through my actions rather than my inheritance, to love and be loved for who I am rather than what I possess." Elizabeth's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by the conviction that had been building since her return. "I'm not the same woman who fled from Charles Mobley's violence. I don't know if I can simply slip back into the role of pampered heiress." Her father leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. "Tell me about these 4 years," he said quietly. "Tell me where you've been and what you've learned." So Elizabeth did. She told him about the Wesley ranch, about the honest work that had filled her days and the simple pleasures that had brought her joy. She told him about Martha's kindness, Ernest's quiet wisdom, and Theodore's gentle strength. She spoke of finding purpose in caring for others, of discovering that happiness could be found in modest circumstances when surrounded by genuine affection. She did not tell him about the love she had lost, about the pain of Theodore's rejection, about the way her heart still ached for the life she had been forced to abandon. Some wounds were too fresh to expose to anyone else's examination. When she finished, her father was quiet for a long time, his weathered hands folded on the white tablecloth between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice thoughtful and measured. "It sounds as though you found something precious in your exile," he said. "Something that money can't buy and privilege can't guarantee." "I did," Elizabeth admitted. "And I lost it when I tried to use this inheritance to help the people I love. They couldn't accept assistance from someone they felt had deceived them about her true circumstances." "Pride is a powerful thing," her father mused. "It can make people reject help they desperately need, especially when accepting it would require them to acknowledge their own limitations." "Yes," Elizabeth said bitterly. "And now they're going to lose everything they've worked for because I couldn't find a way to help them without destroying their trust in me." Her father was quiet again, but Elizabeth could see the wheels turning in his mind. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with the kind of calculating intelligence that had built the Hammond fortune. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "there's a way to help them that doesn't involve charity from Elizabeth Hammond." Elizabeth looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean that the Hammond shipping interests are always looking for reliable suppliers of beef for our cargo ships. Fresh meat is essential for long voyages, and we pay premium prices for quality cattle from reputable ranchers." Her father's smile was slight but meaningful. "Of course, we would need to establish relationships with Western suppliers, probably through intermediaries who understand the local markets." Understanding began to dawn in Elizabeth's mind. "You're suggesting we create a business relationship with the Wesley Ranch?" "I'm suggesting we create a business relationship with a cattle broker who happens to work with ranchers in Colorado. If that broker chooses to focus his efforts on a particular ranch because he believes in their quality and reliability, well, that would be a matter of sound business judgment rather than charity." Elizabeth felt hope stirring in her chest for the first time since leaving the ranch. But would Theodore accept such an arrangement? Even if he didn't know about my involvement? "Men will accept fair payment for honest work when they wouldn't accept charity," her father said pragmatically. "Pride is satisfied when there's value exchanged rather than simple gifts given." The plan that emerged over the following weeks was elegant in its simplicity. The Hammond companies would indeed establish a relationship with a livestock broker named Jonathan Mills, a fictional identity supported by carefully prepared documentation and managed through a network of intermediaries. Mills would approach Theodore Wesley with a proposition: exclusive contracts to supply beef to the Hammond shipping fleet, with advance payments generous enough to clear the ranch's debts and provide operating capital for expansion. Elizabeth threw herself into the details with an energy she hadn't felt since her return to Boston. She studied cattle markets, shipping schedules, and the logistics of moving livestock from Colorado to eastern ports. She corresponded with freight companies and processing facilities, building a web of legitimate business relationships that would support the fiction of Jonathan Mills. Her father watched her transformation with obvious satisfaction. The listless, grief-stricken woman who had returned from exile was being replaced by someone with purpose and drive, someone who had found a way to channel her intelligence and resources toward a meaningful goal. "You've changed," he observed one evening as they reviewed the latest contracts. "Not just from the woman you were before you left, but from the woman who returned to Boston. You seem more yourself, if that makes sense." Elizabeth looked up from the shipping manifests she was studying. "I think I'm finally understanding who I really am," she said. "I'm not just Sarah McKenna, the servant girl who found peace in simple work. And I'm not just Elizabeth Hammond, the heiress who inherited more money than she could ever spend. I'm someone who can use the advantages I was born with to protect the things I've learned to value." "That sounds like wisdom," her father said approvingly. "True wisdom comes from understanding how to use power responsibly rather than simply possessing it." The final piece of the plan fell into place when Elizabeth arranged for Jonathan Mills to visit Colorado personally to inspect potential suppliers. Of course, Mills would need an assistant familiar with Eastern business practices, a young woman with experience in managing complex transactions who could travel west without attracting undue attention. Elizabeth smiled as she packed her bags for the return journey to Colorado. Sarah McKenna might have been forced to leave the Wesley Ranch in defeat, but Elizabeth Hammond was returning with the power to save it. The question that remained was whether she could do so without revealing her identity, and whether saving the ranch would be enough to heal the wounds that had been opened between her and Theodore. As the train carried her west through the familiar landscape of plains and mountains, Elizabeth felt a sense of anticipation she had not experienced since childhood. She was no longer fleeing from an unwanted life or returning in exile to a gilded cage. She was choosing her own path, using her advantages to protect what mattered to her, and perhaps, if she was very careful and very lucky, finding a way to bridge the gap between Elizabeth Hammond and Sarah McKenna. The woman who stepped off the train in Denver was neither the frightened girl who had fled Boston 4 years ago nor the defeated heiress who had left the Wesley Ranch 3 months earlier. She was someone new, someone who had learned to embrace both sides of her identity and use them in service of love rather than in conflict with it. Whether Theodore would be able to see past her deception to the truth of her feelings remained to be seen. But Elizabeth was determined to try, armed now with the wisdom that love sometimes required not just sacrifice, but strategy. The spring thaw had come early to the Colorado mountains, turning the world into a symphony of rushing water and emerging green. Elizabeth stood on the platform of the Swordsville station, breathing in air that carried the scent of snowmelt and new grass, feeling as though she were inhaling hope itself. 3 months had passed since her departure in defeat and sorrow. Now she had returned as Miss Catherine Mills, personal assistant to the livestock broker Jonathan Mills, carrying contracts that could save the Wesley ranch without compromising anyone's pride. Her heart hammered as she supervised the unloading of her luggage, knowing that within hours she would see Theodore again. Would he recognize her despite the fine traveling clothes and carefully arranged hair? Would the months of separation have softened his anger, or had time only hardened his heart against her memory? The hotel in Swordsville was the same Palmer House where she had first learned the truth about her identity, but now she occupied it under different circumstances. Miss Catherine Mills was a competent businesswoman with letters of introduction from respected Eastern firms, not a confused servant girl seeking answers about her past. The transformation felt both liberating and strange, as though she were playing a role that was simultaneously authentic and artificial. That evening, as she prepared for the next day's journey to the ranch, Elizabeth found herself standing before the mirror in her hotel room, studying the reflection that looked back at her. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue wool, expertly tailored and obviously expensive, but not ostentatiously so. Her hair was arranged in a sophisticated style that spoke of city fashion, and her bearing carried the confidence of a woman accustomed to conducting important business. She looked nothing like Sarah McKenna, the simple ranch hand who had swept floors and mended fences. But neither did she look like the Elizabeth Hammond who had fled Boston in terror 4 years ago. This woman was someone new, someone who had learned to bridge worlds rather than flee from them. The ride to the Wesley ranch the next morning passed through familiar countryside that called to her heart with every mile. The aspens were just beginning to show their first tender leaves, the creek ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the meadows were dotted with the early wildflowers that had always marked the true beginning of spring. Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes as she recognized landmarks that had become dear to her during her years of exile. The lightning-struck pine where Theodore had once kissed her forehead when they thought she might not survive a fever, the bend in the creek where she had taught herself to fish during the long summer evenings. The ranch buildings came into view as the hired carriage crested the familiar hill, and Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. Everything looked smaller than she remembered, more weathered and worn. The winter had been hard on the property, and she could see signs of deferred maintenance everywhere. Loose boards on the barn, sagging fence posts, equipment that needed repair or replacement. Her heart ached to see tangible evidence of the family's financial struggles. Theodore was waiting on the front porch when the carriage pulled up, and the sight of him struck Elizabeth like a physical blow. He looked older, thinner, with new lines of worry around his green eyes and a subtle stoop to his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried too long. But he was still the man she loved, still possessed of that quiet dignity and gentle strength that had first captured her heart. He stepped forward as she descended from the carriage, his expression politely welcoming but wary. Elizabeth felt a flutter of panic as his eyes searched her face. Did he recognize something familiar in her features despite the months of separation and her transformed appearance? "Miss Mills, I presume?" he said, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Theodore Wesley. I understand you're here on behalf of Mr. Mills regarding a livestock contract." His voice was exactly as she remembered it, warm and measured, but there was a formality in his manner that cut her to the quick. This was how he would greet any business associate, with courtesy and respect, but without warmth or personal interest. "Indeed I am," Elizabeth replied, fighting to keep her voice steady as she accepted his handshake. The familiar calluses on his palm sent a jolt of recognition through her that she struggled to conceal. Mr. Mills sends his regrets that he could not make the journey personally, but he felt that my familiarity with our Eastern operations would be valuable in assessing potential partnerships. Of course. Please, come inside. My parents are eager to meet you. Elizabeth followed him into the house she had once called home, noting the small changes that spoke of her absence, the way Martha had rearranged the kitchen to accommodate working alone, the stack of papers on Ernest's desk that suggested complicated financial maneuvering, the general air of quiet struggle that pervaded the rooms she had once filled with her own industry. Martha was waiting in the parlor, dressed in her best dress and wearing an expression of hopeful anxiety that made Elizabeth's heart clench. The older woman rose as they entered, her movements a little stiffer than Elizabeth remembered, her silver hair showing more white at the temples. "Mrs. Wesley," Elizabeth said, grateful that years of Eastern education had taught her to control her emotions even in difficult circumstances. "I'm Catherine Mills. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "The pleasure is ours, Miss Mills," Martha replied, though her keen eyes studied Elizabeth's face with an intensity that made her nervous. "Please, sit down. I've prepared some refreshments." As Martha bustled about serving coffee and cake, Elizabeth found herself studying the familiar room with new eyes. The furniture was the same, but she noticed details that had escaped her attention during her years as a servant: the quality of the wood, the craftsmanship of the joinery, the subtle signs of genteel poverty that marked a family trying to maintain standards with insufficient resources. "Mr. Wesley," she began, settling into the chair that Theodore indicated, "Mr. Mills has asked me to discuss the possibility of establishing an exclusive contract for supplying beef to the Hammond shipping fleet. We've been looking for reliable Western suppliers who can provide high-quality livestock on a regular schedule." Theodore's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of the Hammond name. "The Hammond companies? I understand they're quite substantial operations." "Indeed they are. Mr. Jonathan Hammond has recently expanded his shipping routes to include regular service to European ports, and he's looking for American beef suppliers who can meet the quality standards his customers expect." Elizabeth was grateful for the hours she had spent studying the details of her father's business. Every word she spoke was technically accurate, even if the full truth was more complex. Ernest entered the room at that moment, drawn by the sound of business being discussed. He looked older and more careworn than Elizabeth remembered, his shoulders bent with worry and his hands showing the effects of taking on physical labor that should have been handled by younger men. "Miss Mills," Theodore said, rising respectfully, "this is my father, Ernest Wesley." "Father, Miss Mills represents a livestock broker who's interested in contracting with us for beef supplies." Ernest's weathered face lit up with the first genuine hope Elizabeth had seen since her arrival. "That's welcome news indeed, Miss Mills. I won't pretend we couldn't use the business. Times have been challenging lately." "I understand," Elizabeth said gently. "Mr. Mills has researched your operation extensively, and he's quite impressed with your reputation for quality and reliability. He believes a partnership could be mutually beneficial." She withdrew a leather portfolio from her traveling bag and spread several documents on the small table between them. The contracts were real, carefully prepared by her father's lawyers, offering terms that were generous without being suspicious. Advance payments to secure future deliveries, premium prices for grass-fed cattle, and guaranteed purchases that would provide the Wesley Ranch with financial stability for years to come. Theodore studied the papers with the focused attention of a man who had been forced to become expert in financial matters through necessity rather than choice. Elizabeth watched his face as he read, noting the way his expression shifted from cautious interest to genuine surprise to something that might have been relief. "These terms are quite generous," he said slowly, looking up to meet her eyes. "Almost too generous. What's the catch?" Elizabeth had anticipated this question and had her answer ready. "Mr. Mills values long-term relationships over short-term profits. He's willing to pay premium prices to suppliers he can trust to deliver consistently high-quality products. The Hammond companies have exacting standards for their provisioning, and they've learned that reliable suppliers are worth investing in." "And the advance payments?" Ernest asked, his voice carefully controlled but unable to hide his eagerness. "Standard practice for establishing new supplier relationships," Elizabeth replied smoothly. "Mr. Mills finds that advance payments allow his suppliers to invest in improvements and expansion that ultimately benefit everyone involved." She could see the family exchanging glances, communicating in the silent language that came from years of shared struggles and mutual dependence. The offer was everything they needed: enough money to pay off their debts, invest in improvements, and secure their future. But Theodore's natural caution warred with his desperate need for exactly this kind of salvation. "We would need to see the cattle operation before finalizing any agreements," Elizabeth continued, sensing the moment to press her advantage. "Mr. Mills insists on personal inspection of all potential suppliers. Would it be possible for me to tour your facilities tomorrow?" "Of course," Theodore said, though she could see the worry in his eyes. The ranch was in poor condition after the hard winter, and he was undoubtedly concerned about what impression it would make on a representative of such a substantial company. "I should mention," Elizabeth added carefully, "that Mr. Mills has particular interest in operations that demonstrate both quality and character. He believes that the integrity of the ranchers reflects in the quality of their cattle." The comment was calculated to ease Theodore's concerns about the ranch's appearance while reinforcing the legitimacy of the offer. Jonathan Mills wasn't just buying cattle. He was investing in people he believed in. That evening, as Elizabeth sat in the small guest room that Martha had prepared for her, she felt a complex mixture of emotions churning in her chest. Being back in this house, surrounded by the family she loved, felt like a homecoming and a heartbreak simultaneously. Every familiar sound: Martha's humming as she prepared dinner, Ernest's gentle snoring from the front room where he dozed in his chair, Theodore's measured footsteps as he made his final rounds of the property, called to her with painful sweetness. She had lain in her narrow bed above the kitchen for 3 years listening to these same sounds, finding peace and belonging in their simple rhythm. Now she was a guest in the room that had once belonged to Theodore's grandmother, sleeping in a proper bed with fine linens, treated with the courtesy due to a business associate rather than the warmth reserved for family. A soft knock at her door interrupted her melancholy reverie. "Miss Mills," Martha's voice called quietly. "Might I have a word with you?" Elizabeth opened the door to find the older woman standing in the hallway with a tea tray, her expression thoughtful and somehow knowing. "I thought you might like some chamomile tea before bed," Martha said, "and I was hoping we might have a chance to talk." They settled into chairs by the window, and Martha poured the fragrant tea with the practiced movements Elizabeth remembered so well. For several minutes they sat in comfortable silence, but Elizabeth could feel the weight of unspoken questions hanging between them. "You seem familiar to me," Martha said finally, her voice gentle but direct. "There's something about you that reminds me of someone I knew once. Someone I cared about very much." Elizabeth's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. "People often say I have one of those faces," she replied lightly. "I'm frequently mistaken for someone else." Martha smiled, but her eyes remained sharp and assessing. "Perhaps. Or perhaps some people make impressions that go deeper than mere appearance." She sipped her tea thoughtfully. "The woman you remind me of was very dear to our family. She worked here for several years, became like a daughter to me and Ernest." "What happened to her?" Elizabeth asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "She left," Martha said simply. "There were circumstances that made it impossible for her to stay, though I believe she would have chosen differently if she could have." The older woman leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I always hoped she might find a way to come back to us somehow." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither woman was quite ready to make explicit. Elizabeth felt tears gathering in her eyes despite her efforts to maintain her professional composure. "Perhaps she has," Elizabeth whispered, abandoning all pretense. Perhaps she's found a way to help the people she loves without compromising their pride or destroying their trust. Martha reached across the small space between their chairs and took Elizabeth's hand in her own. "Sarah," she said softly, and the name was like a blessing. "Elizabeth," came the correction, equally soft. "But yes, also Sarah. I'm both now, Martha. I've learned to be both." Tears were flowing freely down both women's faces now, years of separation and sorrow dissolving in the simple recognition of love that had never truly been lost. "Does he know?" Martha asked, glancing toward the wall that separated them from Theodore's room. "No, and I'm not certain he should. The contracts are real, Martha. The business opportunity is legitimate. He can accept it with his pride intact, never knowing that Elizabeth Hammond had anything to do with his salvation." Martha studied her face for a long moment. "Is that what you want? To save him without him ever knowing what you've sacrificed to do it?" Elizabeth wiped her eyes with the handkerchief Martha offered her. "I want him to be happy. I want this ranch to survive and prosper. I want you and Ernest to have security in your old age. If that means I remain Catherine Mills, the business representative who helped arrange profitable contracts, then so be it." "And what about your happiness, child?" The question pierced Elizabeth's carefully constructed emotional defenses. "I forfeited my right to happiness when I deceived him about who I was. But perhaps I can find peace in knowing that I've used my advantages to protect what matters most." Martha was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup, her expression thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the wisdom of decades spent navigating the complexities of love and family. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "the greatest act of love is not protecting someone from the truth, but trusting them enough to let them choose how to respond to it." Elizabeth felt the words resonate in her chest like the tolling of a bell. Was she protecting Theodore by maintaining her deception, or was she robbing him of the chance to choose forgiveness over pride, love over wounded feelings? The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a kind of crystalline air that made everything seem possible. Elizabeth dressed carefully in practical clothing suitable for touring ranch facilities, but she took extra care with her appearance, knowing that Theodore would be studying her closely as he showed her around the property he loved. He was waiting for her after breakfast, mounted on his favorite horse with a gentle mare saddled for her use. "I thought we'd start with the pastures," he said as he helped her mount. "The grass is coming in well this spring, and the cattle are looking better than they have in months." As they rode across the familiar landscape, Elizabeth found herself falling back into the easy rhythm of companionship that had characterized her relationship with Theodore during her years as Sarah McKenna. He pointed out improvements he hoped to make, explained his breeding program for developing hardier cattle, and shared his vision for expanding the operation if finances allowed. "You really love this place," she observed as they paused on a hill overlooking the ranch buildings. "It's been in my family for 2 generations," Theodore replied, his voice carrying a depth of emotion that went beyond mere business. "My grandfather started with nothing but hope and determination. My father built it into something substantial. I've been trying not to be the generation that loses it all." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Elizabeth felt her heart ache for the burden he had been carrying alone. "From what I've seen, Mr. Wesley, you have nothing to be ashamed of. The quality of your operation is evident, and Mr. Mills will be impressed with what you've accomplished under difficult circumstances." Theodore turned to look at her directly, and for a moment she thought she saw recognition flicker in his green eyes. "You speak as though you understand something about difficult circumstances yourself, Miss Mills." "Everyone faces challenges," Elizabeth replied carefully. "The measure of a person is how they respond to adversity." They completed the tour in companionable silence, and Elizabeth was pleased to see that despite the obvious effects of financial strain, the ranch remained fundamentally sound. The buildings needed maintenance, the equipment required updating, and the herds were smaller than they should be, but the foundation was solid. With the infusion of capital that the Hammond contracts would provide, the Wesley ranch could not only survive but thrive. That afternoon, as they sat around the kitchen table reviewing the final contract details, Elizabeth felt a bittersweet satisfaction in watching the family's excitement as they realized their salvation was at hand. Ernest's shoulders straightened as the weight of impossible debt lifted from them. Martha's face glowed with relief and hope for the future. And Theodore. Theodore remained cautious, studying the papers with careful attention to every detail, but Elizabeth could see the moment when he finally allowed himself to believe that this miraculous opportunity was real. The transformation in his expression was worth every sacrifice she had made to create this moment. "If you're satisfied with the terms," Elizabeth said formally, "I'm authorized to provide the first advance payment immediately." She withdrew a bank draft from her portfolio, the amount sufficient to clear all the ranch's debts with money left over for immediate improvements. Ernest's hands shook slightly as he accepted the draft, and she saw tears in his eyes as he realized that his family's legacy was secure. "Miss Mills," Theodore said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you for this opportunity. You've saved not just our ranch, but our entire way of life." Elizabeth met his eyes across the table, seeing in them a depth of gratitude that made her own eyes water. "Mr. Mills believes in investing in quality people, Mr. Wesley. Your reputation for integrity and hard work made this decision easy." That evening, as the family celebrated their good fortune with a special dinner, Elizabeth found herself torn between joy at their happiness and sorrow at her continued separation from it. She was part of their celebration, but apart from it, welcomed as a helpful stranger but not embraced as the family member she longed to be. After dinner, she stepped outside for air and found herself walking toward the small cemetery on the hill where she had last spoken honestly with Theodore before her departure 3 months ago. The spring evening was soft and warm, filled with the sounds of awakening life: frogs in the creek, the distant lowing of cattle, the gentle whisper of wind through new leaves. She was standing among the weathered headstones when she heard footsteps behind her. Theodore approached slowly, his hands in his pockets, his expression thoughtful in the fading light. "I come here sometimes when I need to think," he said, coming to stand beside her. "There's something peaceful about this place, something that puts problems in perspective." "It's beautiful," Elizabeth replied truthfully. "Your family has deep roots here." "They do." Theodore was quiet for a moment, then added, "I used to bring someone here occasionally. Someone I cared about very much." She understood the importance of family legacy, of preserving what previous generations had built. Elizabeth's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What happened to her?" "She left," Theodore said simply, echoing his mother's words from the night before. "She had to leave, actually. Circumstances made it impossible for her to stay, though I've often wondered if there might have been another way." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Elizabeth felt tears sliding down her cheeks in the gathering darkness. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," Theodore admitted. "I've thought about her constantly since she left, wondered where she went, whether she was safe, whether she ever thought about us." He paused, then added quietly, "Whether she ever thought about me." Elizabeth turned to face him fully, no longer caring about maintaining her disguise. In the soft twilight, with emotion washing away her careful pretenses, she looked exactly like the woman who had once swept his floors and mended his clothes and gradually stolen his heart. "She thinks about you constantly," Elizabeth whispered. "She never stopped loving you, Theodore. She never stopped wishing she could come home." For a long moment, Theodore simply stared at her, recognition dawning slowly in his green eyes. When understanding finally came, it hit him like a physical blow, and she saw him sway slightly as the full implications registered. "Elizabeth," he breathed, and her name on his lips was like a prayer answered. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm Elizabeth Hammond. I'm also Sarah McKenna. And I'm Catherine Mills, the woman who arranged for Jonathan Mills to offer you contracts that will save your ranch. I'm all of these people, Theodore, because I learned that identity isn't about choosing one truth over another. It's about finding ways to honor all the truths that make you who you are. Theodore reached out slowly, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly, and touched her face with gentle fingers. "You came back," he said wonderingly. "You found a way to come back." "I found a way to help you that doesn't compromise your pride," Elizabeth corrected softly. "The contracts are real, Theodore. The money comes from legitimate business dealings. You're not accepting charity from Elizabeth Hammond. You're entering into a profitable partnership with the Hammond shipping companies through their authorized broker." "But you're Elizabeth Hammond," Theodore said, understanding beginning to dawn. "You're the one making this possible." "I'm a woman who learned to use her advantages to protect the people she loves," Elizabeth replied. "I'm someone who finally figured out that wealth isn't a burden or a barrier. It's a tool that can be used wisely or foolishly depending on the wisdom of the person wielding it." Theodore's hands moved to frame her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears that continued to fall. "I was wrong to send you away," he said urgently. "I was hurt and proud and stupid, and I nearly lost the most important thing in my life because of it." "You weren't wrong to be hurt," Elizabeth said gently. "I should have trusted you with the truth from the beginning. I should have believed that your love was strong enough to bridge the gap between Sarah McKenna and Elizabeth Hammond." "It is strong enough," Theodore said fiercely. "It's strong enough to survive anything, Elizabeth. I love all of you. The servant girl who worked beside me, the heiress who sacrificed her comfort to live simply, and the woman who found a way to save everything I care about without destroying my pride in the process." He kissed her then, and Elizabeth felt 4 years of pain and separation dissolve in the warmth of his embrace. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it, not the choice between 2 different lives, but the integration of both into something richer and more meaningful than either could be alone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and laughing with relief and joy, Theodore rested his forehead against hers and spoke the words she had never dared hope to hear. "Marry me," he said simply. "Marry me as Elizabeth Hammond or Sarah McKenna or Catherine Mills or whoever you want to be. I don't care about your name or your inheritance or the complications it might bring. I care about you, all of you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that love is stronger than pride." Elizabeth felt her heart soar with a happiness so pure it was almost painful. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes to all of it. The complications, the challenges, the beautiful impossibility of loving across different worlds. Yes, Theodore Wesley, I'll marry you." As they walked back toward the ranch house hand in hand, Elizabeth realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for since the night she fled Boston 4 years ago. Not escape from who she was, but acceptance of all she could become. Not the choice between wealth and love, but the wisdom to use both in service of something greater than either alone. The lights of the house beckoned warmly in the darkness, promising a future filled with the simple joys she had learned to treasure and the complex possibilities that came with the courage to embrace both her identities. She was Elizabeth Catherine Hammond, and she was Sarah McKenna, and she was the woman who had learned that the heart's truest home was not in choosing one truth over another, but in finding the grace to live fully in both. Behind them, the spring wind whispered through the cemetery where generations of Wesleys rested, carrying their blessing toward a future that honored both legacy and transformation, tradition and change, the simple truths of love and the complex gifts of grace.